The first time Father Callum heard the choir sing, the cathedral was empty, and had been for 45 years. No footsteps, no doors, no living voice. Just 12 perfect notes drifting down from the loft, where no child had stood since the night the school burned and the boys never came home. The 13th note, when it came, was wrong. Not out of tune, out of time, like something that had waited too long to be remembered. Please subscribe before watching. Thank you. St. Michael's Cathedral, present day. The first echo came on a Tuesday. Father Callum Darcy had been asleep less than an hour when it stirred him. Soft at first, barely more than a whisper. He sat up in the rectory bed, the moonlight slicing across the foot of his quilt like a pale benediction, and held his breath. The sound was unmistakable to anyone who had spent a life in the church. Not a creak, nor the groan of timber cooling under evening air. It was chanting, Latin, melodic, perfect. Puer natus est nobis, et filius datus est nobis. The phrase curled like incense through the stone bones of the cathedral, fading before it reached its amen. For a long moment, Father Callum remained still, his hands pressing gently against his knees, as though he were bracing for something more. Silence returned. Thick, weighted, expectant. Perhaps it had been a dream. He rose, feet touching the cold floor, and moved to the window. From there, he could see the nave across the courtyard. The cathedral stood in solemn silhouette against the ink-black sky, its bell tower pointing heavenward like a stern finger of God. No lights burned inside. The place was sealed, the doors locked as they were every evening by the sacristan at precisely 9 p.m. Still, the sound had come from inside. He watched a while longer, waiting for movement, light, anything to suggest someone had wandered in. But nothing stirred. Father Callum Darcy had served in 5 parishes during his 20 years in the cloth. He had dealt with crumbling roofs, broken marriages, and the slow hemorrhaging of faith in communities that no longer feared God. But this was something else entirely. It was his 6th month at St. Michael's Cathedral, a monolithic stone church built in the late 1800s, once a vibrant hub of Catholic life, now mostly a hollow shell echoing with nostalgia and loss. The attached school had burned in 1980, long before his time. Only the sanctuary remained, like a body missing its soul. And now, it seemed, something had returned. The next morning, he arrived early at the cathedral. Before the elderly sacristan, Mrs. Renner, could shuffle down the cobblestone path with her keys and thermos of oversteeped tea. He let himself in, using his master key, the heavy iron door groaning like it disapproved of such haste. The interior was dark, the scent of incense clinging to the air like memory. He moved quietly through the nave, the echo of his footfalls carried up into the high rafters. As he passed the choir loft stairs, his hand hesitated, almost reflexively, over the railing. The steps creaked under his weight as he ascended. The choir loft had not been used in years. The digital organ had replaced the old pipe system, and the choir itself was now reduced to a trio of retirees with hymnals. Dust coated the pews in the loft. Cobwebs stitched across the old music stands like veils. He stood for a long while, staring at the empty stalls, as if expecting some remnant of last night's voices to still linger in the air. But all was still. He turned and looked down at the nave below. Rows of pews bathed in soft gray light filtered through stained glass. The image of the Archangel Michael vanquishing Satan glared down from the apse with sword raised and wings flared in triumph. For a fleeting moment, Father Callum felt foolish. Perhaps he had dreamt it. Still, something nagged at him. Back in the sacristy, he opened the maintenance log, a tattered leather-bound book that predated most of the congregation. He flipped to the entry marked October 3rd, 1980, the day after the school fire. The lines were sparse. Electrical fire. East wing. 12 choir boys and 2 staff presumed dead. Choir loft sealed, access restricted, investigation closed. He traced the name of the choir master, a man named Elliot Farrow, and then of the only survivor listed, a student named Thomas Greaves. Neither name meant anything to him, but perhaps the diocesan archives held more. As he sat there in silence, the church still slumbering around him, Father Callum whispered to no one, "Lord, grant me wisdom. Let me not fear shadows if truth walks among them." That evening the chanting returned, this time clearer, stronger. Salve Regina, Mater Misericordia, Vita Dulcedo, et spes nostra, salve. 12 voices, boys' voices, and somewhere among them, a 13th, a voice just slightly out of tune, a voice that did not harmonize, but watched. The diocesan archives were housed in the sub-basement of the chancery office, a space that smelled faintly of mildew and old incense. It was a place where forgotten ledgers, baptismal registries, and sacramental records waited in silence for someone to remember them. Father Callum stood beneath the flickering fluorescent light, his clerical collar slightly askew, a leather messenger bag slung across his shoulder, a box labeled St. Michael's Cathedral, School Fire, 1980. Sat before him, its edges worn, the top flaps barely holding together. He opened it gently, as one might open a coffin. Inside were browned manila folders, news clippings, charred class rosters, and a few faded photographs. He reached first for the school ledger, a thick volume bound in cracked navy blue leather, the name of the school etched in gold leaf that had long since dulled. He flipped through the final pages of 1980. His finger paused on a line dated September 29th, 3 days before the fire. Autumn recital, all choir boys in attendance. Father Emile presiding. Mr. Farrow leading. Below the typed names of the choir boys was a note scribbled in pen, faint but legible. Addendum, possible late admission. A.B., pending documentation. Father Callum frowned. There was no full name, just A.B. He checked the main registry. 12 names were listed, 12 boys between the ages of 10 and 14, all presumed dead. And yet, this cryptic addendum suggested a 13th child, added hastily and unofficially. No baptismal record, no family contact, just initials. He thumbed through the next folder. Incident report, Cathedral School Fire. The official account was brief and clinical. Cause, electrical fault in the east wing, likely due to outdated wiring. Casualties, 12 students, 2 teachers. Survivors, Thomas Greaves, student. Elliot Farrow, music instructor, severely injured. No mention of A.B., no mention of a 13th body or of an anomaly. And yet, folded inside the report was a newspaper clipping from the Eldridge Courier, dated October 4th, 1980. The headline read, "Tragedy at St. Michael's. Community mourns loss of children in Cathedral School." Blaze, a grainy photograph accompanied the article. What remained of the school, reduced to scorched stone and blackened timber. Firefighters stood among smoldering debris. In the corner of the photo, just barely visible, stood a figure in a long black coat, partially obscured by smoke. The caption read, "Fire officials and school staff survey damage. Cause still under investigation." Callum squinted. The image was too blurred to make out faces, but the silhouette didn't match the build of the choir master. It was taller, straight, more like a priest. He sat back on the creaky wooden chair and rubbed his eyes. Outside, the winter sun had begun to fade, casting pale orange rays across the concrete floor. He realized he'd been sitting for nearly 4 hours. When he returned the folder to the box, a name caught his eye on a loose form beneath the incident report. Elliot Farrow, listed as released from diocese due to medical leave. No return. Curious, Callum jotted the address listed on the file. Farrow had retired to a nursing home on the edge of town, and closed the box gently. The next afternoon, Father Callum stood before the sliding glass doors of Trinity Pines Residential Care. It was a humble facility, clean, quiet, surrounded by leafless trees and wheelchair-friendly paths that wound in lazy loops through the frost-bitten garden. He signed in at the front desk. "Elliot Farrow," he said. "I believe he used to work at St. Michael's School before the fire." The nurse, a sturdy woman in her 60s with tired eyes, frowned. "He's not well," she said, lowering her voice. "Hasn't spoken much in years. Some days he recognizes people. Most days he doesn't." "I'd still like to try," Callum replied softly. "I think he may remember something only he can tell." She led him to a modest room at the end of the hall. Inside, an old man sat in a recliner by the window, a blanket draped over his legs. His eyes stared toward the brittle treetops outside, unfocused. "Mr. Farrow?" the nurse said gently. "You have a visitor." The man turned his head slowly. His features were sharp beneath thin, papery skin. His eyes, though faded, held depth. "This is Father Callum," she continued. "He's from St. Michael's." A pause, then the old man's mouth twitched slightly. "St. Michael's?" he repeated. His voice was low, raspy. "Still standing?" "Yes," Callum said, pulling up a chair beside him. "The cathedral is intact, but the school, the fire—" "I remember," Farrow whispered, his eyes drifting back to the window. "I remember the fire." Silence settled between them. Callum leaned forward. "Do you remember the choir boys?" Farrow's eyes blinked slowly. Then, "Beautiful voices. Too beautiful." "What do you mean?" Farrow didn't answer. Instead, he lifted a trembling hand and traced something in the air, a slow, circular motion. It was a motion Callum recognized instantly, the sign of the cross. "They came back," Farrow whispered. "After the fire, they came back in dreams. I hear them at night, always singing, always watching." Callum felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. He took a breath. There were 12 names in the registry, but I found a note, an addendum. A. B. "Do you know who that was?" Farrow's jaw clenched. "No name," he said. "Just showed up one day. Strange boy. Kept to himself, always watching the others. Father Emile said not to worry. Said the church had ways of helping boys like that, special boys." Callum frowned. "What does that mean?" But Farrow had retreated again into silence. His lips moved, wordlessly at first. Then softly, almost as if reciting a prayer. "In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti." And then, as the last syllable faded, he whispered one final thing before closing his eyes. The 13th didn't burn. He stayed. That night the chanting returned once more. This time, it wasn't just the voices. It was the smell. Smoke, sweet and old, like incense burned too long. St. Michael's Cathedral, Archives Room. The following day was damp with rain, and the cathedral loomed like a stone sentinel wrapped in fog. The air outside smelled of wet pine and candle wax. Inside, it was colder than usual, despite the boilers rattling to life in the maintenance tunnels far below the sanctuary floor. Father Callum descended into the old sacristy archives, where forgotten sacramental records slumbered in wooden cabinets beneath the vestry. Most priests avoided the room. The light was poor, the smell of damp and mildew clung to everything, and the walls sweated in winter. But Father Callum didn't mind. In fact, he found its stillness comforting. He slid open a long oak drawer marked Saint, Michael's School Records 1970 to 1980, and withdrew a wide leather-bound volume. The Student Ledger, a handwritten register listing every boy enrolled in the school in the decade leading up to the fire. His fingers moved slowly down the neat columns, each child's name accompanied by a date of birth, date of enrollment, parent or guardian name, and status. Active, graduated, or in the case of those who perished in 1980, deceased. 12 names were marked with that final word. Callum read each carefully, whispering their names aloud as if giving voice to something sacred. Michael Doherty, Jonathan Reyes, Eli Strong, Benjamin Knox. The list ended with Stephen Arledge, age 13. The final official entry. Callum tapped the page gently. Then he turned to the back flyleaf of the ledger, where priests had occasionally scribbled unofficial notes. And there it was again, the same notation he had seen in the diocesan archive. A B, late edition. No baptismal certificate on file. Placed under Father Emil's oversight. No parent contact info. That was it. No birth date, no full name. Just AB, and a quiet note that the boy had been under the care of Father Emil Blaine, the former rector of St. Michael's. Father Blaine had died in 1982. A stroke in his sleep. Buried in the priest's cemetery behind the chapel. No scandal, no suspicion. He was remembered as stern but dedicated, and yet... Callum stared at the page. His breath fogged slightly in the cold. Who brings a child into a school, a religious school, without record, family, or sacrament? He turned the page again and found something stranger still. Pasted onto the inside back cover was a faded photograph, curled at the edges, stuck with brittle yellowed tape. It was a candid picture. The boys' choir, dressed in cassocks, standing in 2 rows before the altar. Mr. Farrow, the choir master, stood to one side. The boys smiled or laughed or stared awkwardly at the camera. Normal, innocent, except one. In the back row, near the end, partially obscured by another boy's shoulder, stood a figure whose expression was off, not smiling, not even looking at the camera. He was looking upward, his head slightly tilted back, as though listening to something none of the others could hear. His features were indistinct, blurred either by motion or by the age of the photo. But there was something unsettling in his posture, something watchful. Callum reached for the magnifying glass on the desk and examined the image closer. The other boys were typical children, rumpled hair, crooked grins, gangly limbs. But this boy, AB, he assumed, was straight-backed, stiff, as though posed by an invisible hand. He looked older than the others, or perhaps it was the expression that aged him. There was no name on the back of the photo, no annotations, no confirmation. But the priest inside Callum, the part of him that had spent years listening not just to confessions, but to what people couldn't say, felt certain this was the boy, the 13th. That night, Callum sat in the small rectory office, the photograph laid before him on the desk, a single candle burning nearby. The radio on his bookshelf crackled faintly with static, though it was off. The choir hadn't returned since the last night. No voices, no smoke, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind that waited. He opened his personal journal and began writing, his script clean and methodical, part priest, part detective. January 14th. I have found a photograph of the choir boys taken just days before the fire. 12 known names, a 13th presence. No record, no family. Mr. Farrow's account confirms the boy existed. Yet all official documentation stops short of naming him. The ledger simply says, "B, who was this child? Why was he brought here? And why does no one speak of him?" Callum set the pen down and stared at the flickering flame. He reached for his rosary and began to pray, not out of routine, but out of need. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. His eyes flicked to the photograph once more. The boy hadn't changed, still watching something else. Later that night, the cathedral organ gave a single, solitary note. One low, breathy chord, as though a ghost had pressed its hand upon the keys. The organ was locked. No one had touched it in years. St. Michael's Cathedral, Restricted wing. The key did not belong to any modern door. It was long, iron and cold, heavy with age, its ornate bow engraved with a faint Latin inscription, Non omnis moriar, not all of me shall die. Father Callum had found it in the bottom drawer of a forgotten cabinet in the sacristy, a drawer that hadn't been opened in decades. The key lay beneath old funeral cards, wax-crusted tapers, and a crumbling liturgical calendar from 1979. He didn't know why he had opened that drawer, only that as he passed the cabinet earlier that afternoon, a strange impulse had pulled his gaze downward, as though something, or someone, had silently whispered, "Look there." He had held the key in his hand for almost 10 minutes before realizing he was gripping it too tightly, the grooves pressing into his palm like a mark. That evening, long after the final Mass, Father Callum waited until the last of the faithful had gone. The sanctuary returned to silence, except for the faint creaking of wooden beams and the occasional echo of his footsteps. He walked past the nave and turned left, toward a corridor rarely used now, the east wing. Once, it had connected the main church to the old choir rehearsal rooms and dormitories of the school before the fire. After the tragedy, the wing had been locked and over time, quietly forgotten. A faded wooden sign still hung over the arch, Clericorum Privatum. No entry without authorization. The door beyond it was sealed with rusted hinges and a tarnished brass lock that had resisted every key on his ring. But not this one. The old iron key slid into the lock with an almost tender familiarity. A heavy click echoed down the corridor like a held breath finally exhaled. Callum hesitated. "Lord, let truth be my companion," he whispered, crossing himself. Then he pushed the door open and stepped into the dust-choked dark. The air was thick with the scent of soot and time. The corridor was narrow, its walls lined with cracked plaster and faded devotional posters. The wallpaper had once been cheerful, soft gold florals, but was now peeling like dried skin. Cobwebs crisscrossed the corners, and debris littered the floor. Broken tiles, fallen plaster, a child's abandoned shoe. He passed the old music room first. Its door stood slightly ajar. Inside, light from his flashlight caught the glint of warped piano keys. The grand piano sat with its lid open like a gaping jaw, its strings snapped or frayed. He stepped inside. On the chalkboard, barely visible beneath years of grime, was a phrase written in Latin. Qui cantat bis orat. He who sings, prays twice. Callum ran his fingers gently over the words, tracing their ghostly outline. Then he saw the wall. Near the piano, someone, perhaps one of the boys, had scratched rows of vertical marks into the plaster. They looked like tally marks. There were 12 sets, and then a 13th, smaller, unfinished. The next room had once served as the choir robing area. Wooden cubbies lined the walls, some still containing child-sized cassocks and surplices eaten through by moths. A broken mirror hung at an angle near the back wall. Father Callum caught his own reflection, distorted, pale, unfamiliar. And behind him, he spun around. No one was there. The air had grown colder. The faintest murmur of music drifted somewhere nearby, so faint he might have imagined it. But it was unmistakably chanted. Just a phrase, a fragment. In paradisum deducant te angeli. May the angels lead you into paradise. His flashlight flickered. The light dimmed, buzzed, then steadied again. He stepped into the final room at the end of the corridor. It had been a private chapel, judging by the layout. A small sanctuary with a narrow altar, now covered in dust. Stained glass windows, partially boarded from the outside, let in slanted beams of pale blue and green. Most were intact, but one had shattered long ago, the fragments scattered across the floor. The centerpiece above the altar was a tall, luminous image of Christ the Shepherd, one hand raised in blessing, the other cradling a lamb. But someone had scratched into the glass at his feet. A crude etching. At first, Callum thought it was graffiti. Then he stepped closer. It was a name. AAB, scratched directly into the hem of Christ's robe. And below it, a single word. Observat. He observes. Suddenly, the low groan of hinges echoed behind him. The door to the room slowly creaked shut on its own. Not slammed, not yanked, just closed. Callum turned sharply, heart pounding. He crossed the floor and pulled the door open again. Empty hallway. But at the far end, near the music room, there was a faint movement, just enough to catch his peripheral vision, like a child slipping around a corner. "Hello?" he called out. Silence. He took a slow breath and walked back through the hallway, checking each room. All still. Nothing disturbed. As he passed the music room again, he noticed something new on the blackboard. The Latin phrase had been erased, and a new one written in uneven chalk letters. Tu non debuisti venire. You should not have come. Back in the sanctuary, Callum locked the door to the east wing once more, this time unsure if it was to protect the church from what lay beyond, or vice versa. He didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, because of the music. It came again just before dawn, soft, beautiful, and mournful. A single boy's voice, singing alone. Dies irae, dies illa, the day of wrath, that dreadful day. The sun rose reluctantly. Fog clung to the cathedral grounds like smoke that had forgotten how to drift. From the rectory kitchen, Father Callum watched the pale light filter through frost-laced windows, illuminating dust motes as they turned slow, weightless circles in the air. He hadn't slept. Even now, the music still echoed faintly in his mind. Not imagined, not dreamt. A solo voice had sung from somewhere within the cathedral's bones. A boy's voice, tender, tragic, and utterly alone. The final notes of Dies Irae still lingered like soot. He poured a cup of coffee and left it untouched, fingers wrapped around the mug for warmth. The quiet was not peace. It was a quiet that breathed, a silence that watched. By mid-morning he returned to the archives, this time with clearer purpose. He had learned enough as a priest to know when the past refused to remain buried. It was not just memory-stirring, it was invitation. He needed to know if A.B. had ever existed in the eyes of the church. So he turned to the most sacred register outside the Book of Life, the baptismal records. The cathedral kept its own, though all records were eventually copied and stored with the diocese. The volumes were massive, bound in black leather, with gold crucifixes pressed into their covers. Each page was inscribed in the careful script of generations of priests. He began with the years surrounding 1979 and 1980. He scanned each line, noting familiar names of boys he had already encountered in the school ledger. Michael Dougherty, Eli Strong, Benjamin Knox, all accounted for. He flipped to a page near the end of 1979. His heart slowed. There was a margin note. Faint, almost erased. No baptism. Placement permitted under pastoral discretion. Entry denied pending full documentation. A biu and beside it, a signature. Father, Emil Blaine. The same man who had overseen St. Michael's during the tragedy. No surname, no birth date, no sacrament. Just initials. A boy who had never been baptized. It explained why there was no sacramental record, no first communion, no confirmation. In the eyes of the church, he did not exist. Yet he had been housed, taught, robed, and counted, if only unofficially, among the choir, and then erased. That afternoon, Callum sat in the pews beneath the stained glass window of the Archangel Michael, holding the old choir photograph in his hands. He looked again at the boy in the back row, the one with the blurred face and tilted head. Had he been a foster case? A runaway? Or something else? As he stared, something occurred to him. The photo, while faded, showed part of the old chapel altar in the background. A small detail, the edge of a silver crucifix, the tip of a crimson sanctuary candle, a corner of carved stone. But what caught his eye now was a small wooden plaque hanging on the wall just to the left of the altar. He rose from the pew, walked to the sanctuary, and approached that same wall. The chapel had long since been repainted and restored, but remnants of the past remained in the subtle curvature of the plaster. The old candle mount still bolted into the stone, and beneath one of those mounts, the faint outline of a rectangle remained in the wall, lighter than the paint around it. A sign once hung there, now removed. He returned to the archives and pulled the cathedral's old inventory ledger. There it was, 1978. Installed new choir dedication plaque, East Chapel. For the 12 voices of innocence, to God alone the glory. 12, not 13. Even the memorial refused to acknowledge A.B. He had sung with them. He had learned beside them. He had died with them. And yet, his name had been scrubbed away, erased from stone, paper, memory. But not from the air, Callum thought. Not from the song. That evening, he did not wait for the voices. He prepared the sanctuary as if for a funeral. He lit candles. He opened the lectionary to the Mass for the dead. He knelt, robed, and prayed. The cathedral remained empty, still. But at midnight the first note came, not in chant, but in breath. A soft inhalation, a drawn note of air, as though lungs long unused had remembered their function. Then the voice began. Just one, a boy, clear, fragile, singing not a hymn, but a single word. Here, Callum stood from the altar, heart pounding in his chest, and whispered into the darkness, "Who are you?" No answer. But the air around him shifted. The candle flames dipped, though there was no draft. "What do you want?" The boy's voice came again, quieter now. "To be known." And then all fell silent once more. No organ, no footsteps, no burning smell. Just the slow, ancient groaning of the cathedral walls as they held the weight of time. Father Callum remained there, standing before the empty altar. The boy had been buried in silence. Now he was asking for witness. The word stayed with him. Here, a fragile syllable, reverberating not just through the cathedral, but through memory, through theology, through the very heart of what it meant to be seen by God and forgotten by men. The next morning, Father Callum walked to the vestry not as a curious investigator, but as a man summoned. He brought the old choir photograph with him, and a prayer. The vestry archives were smaller than the diocesan vaults, but older. Hidden beneath a hinged floor panel behind the organ, the archive room contained only what was deemed non-essential but culturally relevant. Most priests hadn't entered it in decades. The air was heavy with the smell of leather bindings, beeswax, and slow decay. Shelves bowed under the weight of music manuscripts, Latin hymnals, and forgotten choral compositions in trembling ink. He ran his fingers along the spines until he came to a narrow blue folio tied with red string. It bore no title on the outside. Inside were original compositions, penned by the former choir master, Mr. Farrow. Neat, ornate music notation filled the pages, each one carefully marked with date and occasion. Corpus Christi, Pentecost, Feast of St. Cecilia. But the final piece was different, untitled. No date, no liturgical occasion, only a phrase scrawled in the margin. For the 13. Callum held his breath. The music itself was elegant, simple, but built in strange modes, dissonant intervals that hovered just above resolution. There were long suspended chords, paired with Latin lyrics that didn't come from the Roman Missal or the Book of Hours. Instead, they read, O ignota vox, filius tenebrarum, cantus tuus resistet oblivioni. O unknown voice, son of shadow, your song shall resist forgetting. It was a canticle, but not one approved by the church. Callum flipped the page. At the bottom of the manuscript, written hastily and in darker ink, was a warning. Do not perform, unapproved, disruptive. And beneath that, in smaller script, Blaine insisted we complete it. Said it was for the lost one. I think we've opened something we don't understand. Blaine, the rector, the one who brought A.B. into the school. Callum carefully replaced the folio into his satchel, heart heavy with realization. This canticle, the lost canticle, as he now thought of it, had been composed for the forgotten boy. Not a memorial, not a prayer, a summoning, or a promise. It had never been meant for mass. It was never meant to be heard again. That evening, Callum sat at the cathedral organ for the first time since arriving at St. Michael's. The instrument was old, temperamental, and sacred. The keys were ivory worn down by generations of sacred music. He opened the folio and placed the lost canticle on the stand. His hands hovered over the keys. Lord, grant me discernment, he whispered. If this is sacrilege, stop me. If this is deliverance, guide me. He played the first chord. The sound was gentle, haunting, minor harmonies rising like smoke, then breaking into intervals that felt too wide, like music that tried to reach something out of tune with earth. As he played, the air in the cathedral seemed to tighten, as though the nave were drawing a breath. Then, on the third page, the lyric came. Ego sum hic. I am here. The candle beside the organ snuffed out. A voice joined him, a boy's voice, singing in unison, matching his every chord, delicate, controlled, impossibly real. Callum froze. His hands left the keys, but the singing continued. The canticle progressed without him. The notes flowed from the pipes of the organ, as though guided by unseen hands. The voice remained unwavering, pure. Then slowly, it began to fragment, splitting into 2, then 3, then 12 voices. A full choir. Callum's eyes burned. The choir of St. Michael's, the lost boys. They were singing again, but not all in harmony. One voice stood apart, slightly out of time, out of key. A presence that didn't belong to the harmony, but existed because of it. The 13th, the one who had been written out of every ledger, plaque, and prayer. The one this canticle had tried to bind in music. The singing stopped, abruptly. Not faded, not closed, cut, as though a curtain had dropped in the middle of a final note. Callum stood in the dark. No music, no sound, just the faint rustle of wind through stained glass. And then, so soft it barely passed for sound, a whisper, not from the rafters or the pipes, but from behind him. He made me sing it. Callum turned. The sanctuary was empty. The air no longer felt sacred. Later that night, Callum sat in the rectory, staring at the manuscript. He had transgressed, not against doctrine, but against silence. And something had heard him. The wind changed. It no longer swept gently through the cathedral rafters, but crawled, as if unsure it had the right to be there. It carried a different sound now, less breeze, more breath, as though the walls themselves had lungs. Father Callum noticed it first during morning prayer. He had been reciting the Psalms alone at the side altar when the stone behind the tabernacle gave a low, hollow knock. Not the sound of shifting timber or pipes expanding. It was rhythmic, purposeful. 3 soft thuds, like knocking on wood from the wrong side. He paused, psalm open in one hand, rosary draped in the other. Then it stopped. Over the next 3 days, the signs multiplied. The organ emitted single notes, always E-flat, always at twilight. The votive candles in the Marian chapel extinguished themselves the moment Callum entered, only to relight the instant he turned his back. And beneath the floorboards in the sacristy, Faint voices began to stir. Not words, not full songs, but melodies. Notes hummed softly as though carried in the marrow of the stone. The cathedral had become a mouth, and something inside was trying to speak. On the fourth night, he brought holy water. He sprinkled the sanctuary steps, the altar stone, the base of the choir loft. He walked the perimeter of the east wing hallway, muttering the prayer of St. Michael under his breath, invoking protection against wickedness and snares. But he could not ignore the weight building in the air. As he reached the old robing room, where once cassocks had hung like banners, he paused. Something tugged at him, not physically but spiritually. A pressure behind the soul, like the gravity of unspoken sin. He opened the door. The mirror, once tilted, now hung straight and still. The room smelled faintly of burning wax, and written on the glass, traced in something gray and ashy, were 5 words. I remember how they looked. Callum's breath caught. The script was jagged, childlike, not paint, not ink, ash. He stepped closer. The mirror's reflection swam slightly, not matching the room behind him. The choir cubbies were there, yes, but their contents were wrong, newer, full. His own reflection was missing. Only the room remained. And then, behind the mirror, within the reflection, movement. A boy, not in front of him, but behind the glass. He was robed in a choir cassock, barefoot, with his hands folded. His face was unclear, as though half remembered, and he was not looking at Callum. He was staring straight ahead, as though watching someone else entirely. Then his head turned slowly, too slowly, and the mirror cracked. A thin line, like a hairline fracture across a wine glass, spread from one corner to the other with a sharp, brittle ping. The boy vanished. That night, Callum opened the Book of Blessings and read every rite of exorcism approved for places, not people. He walked the church with incense and prayers, his voice hoarse by the time he reached the apse. He poured oil across the threshold of the east wing and placed a blessed crucifix in the center of the floor. Then he sat in the front pew, waiting. At 3:13 a.m., the choir loft began to creak. Slow, deliberate footsteps above him. He looked up, no one, but the sound of feet across floorboards continued. Small feet, hesitant, measured. Then came a cough, dry, young, followed by a hum. The same tune, again and again. Ego sum hic, ego sum hic, ego sum hic. I am here, I am here, I am here. Then silence, and the cold returned. The next morning, Father Callum met with the diocesan vicar. He did not share the full truth. He knew better. Stories of music and mirrors would earn him a sabbatical, not support. Instead, he asked for permission to exhume Father Emile Blaine's personal files, citing a need for historical clarity regarding the events of 1980. The request was reluctantly approved. Back in the archive room, he retrieved Blaine's sealed box from its resting place beneath the cathedral registry. It bore a wax seal, the bishop's crest imprinted in red. Most priests never bothered with it. Too many old letters, too little relevance. But Callum knew this wasn't clutter. This was a key. Inside were sermons, handwritten mass notes, and a leather-bound journal. He opened to the final entry. The handwriting was tight, unraveling, erratic. The boy does not pray with the others. He listens, watches, he mimics, but I fear it is not reverence. It is memory. Ancient memory. I thought I was sheltering a soul, but now I wonder if I have opened a door. A later passage. Pharaoh tried to stop the final canticle, said the boy reacted violently. He refused to sing unless the others joined. Blamed the church for forgetting him, for denying him the waters of baptism. I told Pharaoh to finish the song. We were too far in, and finally, the fire was not the end. It was the beginning. Father Callum closed the journal. Outside, the cathedral bells chimed noon, but no one had rung them. Trinity Pines Residential Care. 2 days later, the sky was iron gray when Father Callum returned to Trinity Pines. The wind had sharpened with the season's turn, and the thin, bare branches in the courtyard scratched against the windows like nails searching for entry. He carried a manila envelope beneath his arm, containing copies of the journal entries written by Father Blaine, as well as the photograph of the choir boys and the lost canticle. He was not entirely certain what he sought, confirmation perhaps, or confession, but Thomas Greaves was the only living student who had survived the fire. And while his name had appeared in several diocesan notes, no formal testimony had ever been recorded. Greaves had vanished from the church altogether shortly after 1980. Now, 45 years later, the man waited for him in a second-floor room overlooking the North Gardens. Callum found him seated by the window, bundled in a cardigan several sizes too large, a crocheted blanket across his knees. His eyes were alert, watchful. "Father Callum," he asked, voice raspy but lucid. Callum nodded, extending a hand. "Mr. Greaves, thank you for agreeing to see me." The man's expression didn't soften, but he gestured to the second chair with a slow nod. "You're the first priest I've let in this room in over 30 years, he said. "Don't make me regret it." "I'll try not to," Callum replied, sitting gently. He opened the envelope and removed the photograph first. Greaves' gaze fell on it. His lips parted, but he said nothing. "Do you recognize them?" A pause, then, "Everyone, except maybe one," Callum said, turning the photo slightly, his finger pointing to the blurred boy in the back row. "This one." Thomas's jaw tightened. Callum leaned in. "Who was he?" The man's eyes did not leave the photo. "He didn't have a name." "He was listed only as A.B., Callum said. "No baptism. No records." "He wasn't one of us," Thomas said quietly. "I don't mean that he didn't belong. I mean he wasn't like us." "In what way?" Thomas swallowed. "He didn't talk much, never smiled. We tried to make him laugh. Eli Strong once snuck a frog into his bed, and A.B. just stared at it. Didn't even flinch. He'd memorize everything, songs, scripture, chants. But when he sang, it didn't sound like music. It sounded like someone reading the notes out loud. As if he was remembering something from before he was born." Callum was silent. Thomas looked up. "And he didn't eat." Callum blinked. "What?" "Never saw him in the mess hall, not once. Always said he'd eaten earlier, but his tray was always clean. No crumbs, no mess. The sisters said he must be tidy. I started to think he was something else, a story God forgot to finish writing." He looked down again. "Pharaoh didn't like him. Said he gave him chills. Said the boy's voice was wrong. Father Blaine insisted he stay." "Did anything happen before the fire?" Callum asked softly. "Something specific?" Thomas nodded slowly. "The night of the fire, we were rehearsing a new hymn. Something Pharaoh had written. Though I always thought Father Blaine was the one who really wanted it sung. Said it was to honor the 13. I didn't understand it then. But I remember Pharaoh kept telling A.B. to stop singing sharp. And A.B. just stood there, still, mouth open, but not really moving." Thomas's voice lowered to almost a whisper. "Then he said something, not Latin, not English, something I've never heard again, and the organ started playing by itself." Callum froze. And then, the fire came. Later, as he drove back through the fog-thickened trees that lined the road to the cathedral, Callum played the lost canticle on a loop in his mind, not with voice or note, but through memory, through fear. The music had not been an offering. It had been an anchor, a way to hold something in place. And perhaps, after all these years, its strength was failing. As he passed the rusted sign at the cathedral's entrance, the bell in the tower gave a low, unprompted chime. He did not look up. That night, when he entered the nave, he found the crucifix upturned on the altar. Not fallen, not broken, deliberately inverted. He stared at it for a long time until he realized someone had placed something at the foot of the altar. A choir robe, child-sized, and on the stole, written in ash, "He was never gone." St. Michael's Cathedral, Feast of the Presentation. The cathedral was full, but no one had entered. Father Callum stood in the back of the nave, his hand resting on the old oak door. The pews stretched before him in solemn rows, bathed in pale candlelight. Yet they were not empty. He could see them, not with his eyes, but in the deep places of knowing, where the soul senses what the mind resists. The boys were here. He could not name them, but he felt them. 12 presences, seated in silence, waiting. And somewhere in the shadows near the altar, a 13th stood apart, watching. Always watching. It was Candlemas Eve, the night the church remembered Christ's presentation in the temple, the purification of Mary, and the flickering hope of redemption. Father Callum had not planned a midnight mass, but the bulletin had been changed. He found the new listing handwritten in careful Latin on the notice board outside the sacristy. Missa in nocte, pro innocentibus mass at night, for the innocents. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but precise, devout. The sacristan swore no one had touched it. He vested in silence, donning black, an unusual color for Candlemas, but appropriate for this liturgy. He set the altar himself, placed 13 candles at the front of the sanctuary, and lit each one. 12 burned steady. The 13th guttered and smoked. He stood behind the altar and whispered the opening lines, "In troibo ad altare Dei," I will go unto the altar of God. No response came from the empty pews, but the air changed. And then, very faintly, the voices began, not from the choir loft, from beneath. The stone trembled with song, not loud, not complete, just the first notes of a familiar chant, Dies Irae. 12 voices, and then a 13th joined, out of harmony, out of key, yet necessary. Father Callum closed his eyes. The sound rose like incense, unbidden, unbearable in its purity. He whispered the Kyrie. Kyrie eleison. Christa eleison. Kyrie eleison. A rush of wind moved through the nave. The 13th candle flared, blue, not gold, and then settled into a steady burn, and that's when he heard it. A new voice, behind him, close, human. Why didn't they come back for me? Callum turned slowly. At the edge of the sanctuary stood a boy. He was no more than 13, barefoot, clothed in a cassock too large for his frame. His hair was pale, his skin like old parchment, and his eyes dark, hollow, unblinking. "You are A.B., Callum whispered. The boy nodded. "Do you remember who you are?" "I remember how they looked at me," the boy said. "Like I was a visitor, not a brother." "You weren't baptized." "No one wanted me named," the boy replied. "Father Blaine said I was special, that I could carry something others couldn't." Callum stepped closer. "What did he make you carry?" The boy's eyes flicked to the choir loft. "They wrote it into me," he whispered. "A song. It opened something. I didn't know it would burn." Callum knelt before him. "You were forgotten, but not by God." The boy blinked slowly. "Then why did he never answer?" "He did," Callum said. "You're still here." The boy looked down at his hands. "I don't know how to leave." Callum rose. "Let me help you." A pause. Then the boy said, "But they can't go until I do." And suddenly the 12 candles began to flicker violently. A cold wind surged through the cathedral, and the voices, the 12 voices, sang as one. For the first time in decades, they harmonized, but the 13th voice stood apart, alone, still not reconciled. Callum moved to the altar and raised his hand in blessing. Lord Jesus Christ, light of the world, have mercy on this child. The boy shuddered. The candles flared. The walls trembled. The windows rang with invisible voices. And then the 13th voice broke. It sobbed. Not screamed, sobbed. A single cry, small, human. Then all the candles extinguished at once. The boy was gone, and the silence that followed was holy. The next morning, the east wing door was unlocked. Inside, the walls were clean, the mirror unbroken. The name A.B. had vanished from the glass. And beneath the altar, the 13th candle still stood, unlit but waiting. The storm broke at midnight. Rain lashed against the cathedral's stained glass windows, wind howling through its eaves like the cry of something long denied absolution. Inside, the candles had all extinguished themselves without breeze or breath. Father Callum stood at the altar with the 13th candle in his hand. It was time. The door beneath the sacristy, the one sealed decades ago with plaster and silent vows, was never meant to open again. The stone steps that led down beneath the cathedral had once connected to the old foundation of the school, and before that, to the crypts of an even older mission church, buried and rebuilt long before St. Michael's had claimed the ground. No official record confirmed its existence, but Callum knew the way. He descended the steps alone, 13th candle lit, its dim blue flame illuminating the dust-coated stairwell. The further he descended, the more the air changed. Cold became something else, something ancient. A presence, not a temperature. At the bottom of the stair was a low stone door. Above it, in carved Latin, Cantate et audietur vox vestra. Sing, and your voice shall be heard. He opened the door. The chamber beyond had been forgotten by man, but not by memory. It was circular, its walls lined with empty niches. Carved into the stone were hundreds of names, children's names, many of them faded, some chiseled away. The floor was covered in thin dust, but at its center stood a wooden choir riser, and sitting upon it, 12 robes, empty, laid out in perfect posture, as if their wearers had simply vanished, leaving behind only shape. And beside them, on a slightly lower tier, a 13th robe. Not laid out, but hung, drifting slightly, though there was no air. Callum stepped forward, every breath a prayer. "Are you here?" he whispered. A long silence. Then, "Yes." The voice came from the 13th robe. It did not echo. It did not linger. It simply existed. "You never left," Callum said. The robe twitched, as if in agreement. "I've seen what they did to you. I've read what they wrote into that music. You carried a burden they did not understand." A soft hum began, low, beneath hearing almost. Callum continued, "But you were not forgotten. Not by him, not by me." He stepped to the riser and placed the 13th candle at the center. Its blue flame shivered. "I don't know your name," Callum said, voice trembling. "But I offer it to God now, as priest, as brother, as witness." He raised his hand and traced the sign of the cross over the candle. "If you seek peace, it is yours." The hum stopped. The robes fell, softly, one by one, as if released from invisible hooks. Then the 13th robe collapsed, and for the first time in 45 years, the room was truly empty. No voices, no watching, only stillness, only grace. Later, Callum would seal the chamber. He would never speak of it in homilies or diocesan reports. But every Candlemas from that night forward, he lit 13 candles, 12 in gold, 1 in blue, and the people never asked why. But the choir always sang in perfect harmony. St. Michael's Cathedral. 1 year later, spring arrived like a secret. Soft rains bathed the old stone of St. Michael's, and the early crocuses bloomed in the cracks along the chapel walk. The bell tower, long silent save for its automatic hourly chimes, rang that morning with human hands, for the first time in years. Father Callum had risen before dawn, not out of ritual, but need. Today was the first anniversary of the night the 13th candle burned. The church calendar marked it as Feast of the Presentation, but for St. Michael's, it was now something more. A local solemnity never spoken aloud, never named in the missal, only remembered in silence and song. The Mass that morning was simple. No procession, no incense, no fanfare. Just Callum, a handful of parishioners, and the voices of the current boys' choir. New children, joyful and wide-eyed, their innocence unshaken by the echoes this church had once held. The offertory hymn was unfamiliar to the congregation. Callum had chosen it deliberately. It was based on fragments from the lost canticle, rewritten, resolved. He'd removed the dissonance, added proper liturgical tone, transformed the song into a prayer of peace, not binding. And when the boys sang it, there was no 13th voice beneath them, no hidden note, just harmony. After Mass, Callum walked alone to the old memorial wall, newly restored and rededicated. The names of the 12 choir boys lost in the fire had been carefully re-engraved, gilded again, polished until they shone, and beneath them, in smaller script, was a final line. Et unus, sine nomine, cognitus Deo, and one, without a name, known to God. He stood before it for a long time, his hand resting on the stone. Then he reached into his pocket. Inside was a small parchment, a certificate, newly signed, newly sealed, though the date written on it was retroactive. Baptismal record name, Alexander Benedict. Date of baptism, February 2nd, 1980. Posthumous recognition. Officiant, Reverend Callum Jude Marks. He had chosen the name carefully. Alexander for protector, Benedict for blessing. He had no authority to baptize the dead. But he also knew this child had never been given a chance to be called anything. And in the mystery of God's mercy, names still mattered. Callum slid the parchment into the crevice beneath the memorial. He sealed it with beeswax. "You were never truly nameless," he whispered. In the vestry that evening, he wrote in his personal journal for the last time on the matter. February 2nd. The choir no longer sings unbidden. The mirrors are clear. The stone no longer breathes. But I still light the 13th candle. Not for fear, for remembrance, because grace does not undo suffering. It redeems it. Sometimes, late at night, when the nave is empty and the wind quiet, he thinks he hears a single footstep behind him. Not heavy, not fearful, just present. And when he turns, there is nothing. But he always whispers anyway, "Peace be with you." Because perhaps, somewhere just beyond the veil, a forgotten boy still listens, and finally knows he is not forgotten.